Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full-contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everybody, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name's Fahed Rahman and I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And today we are going to be reviewing Do Not Resuscitate by Maurice Saatchi. Do you want to read out the blurb for this one, Poppy?
Yes, so. Maurice Saatchi is dead. He is standing in front of the gates of heaven. Arrival halls worse than Heathrow, queues, overcrowding, a tidal wave of paradise seekers, ID scans, voice and facial recognition, X-ray examinations, background checks. It all seems like a bad dream. His tests expose abnormalities. He is charged with multiple breaches of immigration law and detained pending a full jury trial. The verdict will reveal the biggest secret of all time: why some people go to heaven and others to hell. Do Not Resuscitate is a bold statement. Maurice Saatchi, a towering figure in the worlds of business and politics, frames his unsparing self-portrait with the conceit of a celestial trial in which his application to pass through the gates of heaven is heard before a jury featuring luminaries like Marilyn Monroe, Pablo Picasso, Chairman Mao and Margaret Thatcher. In seeking admission to heaven, Saatchi offers a defence like no other.
And I'll just read out a short bio of Maurice Saatchi. Maurice Saatchi graduated from London School of Economics, where he won the Macmillan Prize for Sociology. He went on to become a governor of LSE. During his time in advertising, he transformed the industry, taking Saatchi & Saatchi from an 11-staff company to being the biggest agency globally. He worked with Margaret Thatcher and John Major on 4 consecutive general election victories. In 1996, he entered the House of Lords and later became Shadow Minister for the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. He became co-chairman of the Conservative Party and chairman of the Centre of Policy Studies. His campaigning efforts in Parliament led to the passage of the 2016 Access to Medical Treatments Innovation Act. And we were given an advance review copy of this audiobook, and Maurice Saatchi is the narrator as well. So it's quite a short book, and it's a bit of an odd thing because it's sort of like a fictionalized autobiography. Would you say? Because it's like the autobiographical stuff I think is true, but kind of like the conceit in which it's framed is kind of unique.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess we'll get onto the plot probably very soon in that sort of structure that you talk about. But first of all, I just want to say that I think it's no surprise that my political views are wildly different to Saatchi's, and especially with, you know, the places I grew up in, the colliery band I was part of, etc. I wouldn't put a certain person from that blurb on the jury to decide who deserves to make it into heaven or not. And I don't want to get into it too much, but I just wanted to say that, A, just for the record, you know, of not endorsing the politics in the book, and B, as kind of a content warning, especially that jury choice, because it did affect me when I heard it, and I know some people will have a greater reason to be upset by it than I do from their direct experiences. So yes, just want people to be expecting it when they listen. But one thing I really liked about the book is that it interrogates the idea of morality kind of in theory to a certain extent away from political, binaries and things like that. So we'll definitely go on to talk about that more. But yes, you can take a lot from this book, even if some or most or all of your views kind of differ from the politics of the author as well. So I thought that was an important note to just start it off with. But yes, the plot. So it's this kind of idea that you have going to heaven as being a immigration sort of process. And I thought it was quite Philip Pullman-esque to have, kind of angels as bureaucrats and stuff like that kind of concept in it that I thought quite interesting. And yeah, you have basically Saatchi's own interrogation of his own morals and effectively asking that question of, do I deserve to go to heaven kind of thing, as well as putting going to heaven as this immigration question, as well as a love letter to his wife who has passed away. So it's a lot of things rolled into one. But yeah, I thought a really interesting concept.
Yeah, very kind of like, I'd be curious to kind of find out why he decided to structure it in that way. So we start off, I've had a bit of a hard time getting into the book because he does start off with we've listened to a few books now that have had really strange opening sequences where it's kind of a lot of like guff coming up. So like the first part of the audiobook is basically him kind of almost reciting immigration rules.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know why authors like front load that into the audiobook. It's like really kind of strange. Maybe there might have been a better way of doing it. And yeah, he structured the scenario in terms of right, this qualifications that you need to have to get into heaven. There's like too many people trying to come through the gates, and we need to have a process for kind of filtering out deserving candidates from less deserving candidates. And I just thought, so we're recording this in March 2023 for kind of like future listeners, and the British government has just decided to go ahead with legislation, which is, I will come out and say, evil. It's evil kind of anti-refugee legislation that kind of will really outside most international standards. And I did do a little bit of immigration law, so I do understand a little bit about the system, but it was just kind of, it's curious listening to him going through that kind of it's kind of, you mentioned like Pullman-esque. It kind of brought me back to like Kafkaesque or Orwellian kind of like faceless bureaucracy, kind of having that in mind in here, and kind of what's happening in the wider world, and how that might have coloured my perception of it a bit.
Yeah, definitely. That was certainly in my mind when I was listening to that beginning part as well. I didn't necessarily find the same objection that you had with the front loading of that information. Yeah. I can certainly see how it would come across that way, but I kind of felt it was more that it was quite immersive. Yeah. Because I felt like we were one of those people in this queue, being faced with, show your papers kind of thing. So I personally felt like that kind of worked, but I can totally see why you felt that was just a load of lists at the start, and also because it is so different to what is, I think, the meat of this book, which is kind of the trial that he goes through for it. But yeah, definitely, it was very poignant listening to it at the moment with the news, and I think it works both ways. I think it's a really interesting way to think about the afterlife in terms of that sort of, what if the way of judging if you get into heaven was done by this sort of way, and taking away what we often think, or a lot of different denominations at least of Christianity and various other religions think about a loving omniscient being that would welcome everybody in, and this is obviously saying that they wouldn't welcome everybody in, and it's tight. So I think it does an interesting thing of questioning religion in the afterlife by giving that idea to it, as I say, a bit like Pullman does with that sort of challenging those ideas, but equally the flip side, it says a lot about immigration policy by pretending it is this thing about heaven, because you've got people who are forced to leave a place, they can't go back to it for various reasons, and they want somewhere where they will be safe and happy, and not somewhere where they will be tortured and suffering. So it's very poignant both ways to have that comparison, I thought. And so a really interesting listen in that sense, but obviously a difficult one as well.
Yeah, I think that's good. So I think we're going to maybe get into slightly spoilery territory now. So I think the central question that is asked of Maurice Saatchi, kind of like the thing in which the trial hinges on is this central question: did you try to change the world for the better? So that's the question that all applicants to heaven are going to be asked, and it'll, whether the jury decides one way or the other is going to be whether they're going to be allowed into heaven or not. Mm-hmm. What did you think about that as being the question?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that as being the question. Yeah. The first being that I think it is an interesting point to take. An interesting kind of central thing that this is all going to hinge around. That, the idea of being good is that you're trying to change the world, as you say, for the better, and that you're not wanting to stick with the current status quo, that you're not lazily sticking with that. And I liked the bit where it was saying about it can be very small things or it can be very big things, but the idea is that you're not just going to settle for what it is, you're going to try and change it. However, I think that's very much at odds, literally, and it kind of talks about this, but literally with the word conservative. If you look at the meaning of that, it is to conserve and to stay the same. And so I found it very interesting that this is the thing that Maurice has decided is what makes you good or bad, when it is at such odds with, the name that is given to the party that he's so involved in. So, yes, I found that very interesting. I have more to say, but I wondered what your thoughts were on those points.
I think it's a fine enough question to kind of ask, mm-hmm. I think, as kind of like whether or not you should be kind of allowed in or not. I think one of the things I wish he kind of maybe should have talked about more is what is the meaning of the word like better? Like what does better look like for him? And he does get at that a little bit in terms of, he talks about social justice. One of the things he's quite passionate about is social mm-hmm. justice and kind of like tackling economic disparity. And I think later on he also kind of, when he's especially in the sections when he's talking about his wife, about improving access to kind of medical care as well. So those are, for me, I agree with you. It was a little bit, like from my point of view, I'm a little bit left leaning. It's like it was just incongruent, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was just wondering while I was hearing it of, wanting to know if he is conflicted with being under that banner of the word conservative, if his kind of ethos, motto, whatever for life is that the thing that makes you good is to look for change. Does that make a conflict? I mean, obviously we know that words, and certainly words that are used as names and labels, can often stray a bit from what their dictionary definition is, right? I get that, but regardless, that is still the name that party goes by, and that's what it holds as its values. So I found it very interesting that, it seems certainly that Maurice's values are, different to that. I'm wondering if he did have a conflict between those two things. And then, as you say about better, I thought that was really interesting. And this kind of goes on to my third point about this change thing, because during the trial scene, when the defendant is sort of trying to justify that they did want to create change in the world with their life and therefore deserve to go to heaven, it really made me think about how change can be framed as either progression or anarchy, or kind of always two different sides of the spectrum. It can be good, it can be bad. A lot of the arguments that the prosecutor uses sound very much like those that are used and have been used against people that make incredible positive change. So things like racial issues, LGBTQ plus issues, climate change, social inequality. There'll be a whole host of people who say that they're too radical, that they're troublemakers, that these are just flights of fancy, that they're dangerous, all sorts of things like that. Either that, thankfully people have pushed past and those guys have been proven wrong, amazing change has happened, or people that, I personally support at the moment and can see, the media, the press, other politicians lobbying these sorts of accusations against them. But then, on that framing, obviously some stuff will be bad change, some stuff will be causing trouble, not everything is good change, as, you know, explored in the very popular recent film Glass Onion. You know, just because you're a disruptor, changing things doesn't necessarily make you a good person. But this did really highlight both, as I said, how the same action can be really framed as good or as bad, and that just listening to that framing, to that really abstracted oversimplification of it, often, you know, by the media or by one particular political party or various things like that, can be so damaging, you know, to oversimplify it and just see these black and white good and bads, and sometimes not even realising what the change that they're talking about is, the practical implications that it will have. And I mean, the simplifying it down is very much talked in here about kind of his political strategy that he put forward, and with the sort of slogans and stuff. And it does sort of, I think, bring up the damage that can be caused by simplifying, that it takes away that nuance of, seeing whether that change is for the better or not for the better. But yeah, I thought it was a really, really fascinating, you know, crux to the book, and made me really enjoy listening to it, but it poses a lot of questions, kind of more than answers.
Yeah, I think one of the things that does happen kind of in the book is, from my point of view, the prosecution was kind of trying to minimize any change that he did have in the world, as kind of like, what you really actually did was just a bunch of like hot air. It didn't actually change anything. I wanted to kind of also pick up on the point you made about kind of so he's a very good communicator. Obviously, that's kind of how he made his money, and kind of how he's helped, you know, both political parties and commercial entities kind of reach their audience. One of the things he does kind of quite eloquently put is, people say, it's just simple sloganeering, but one of the points he made was about political speeches. Unless you're able to kind of like pin down in kind of a couple of sentences what a political speech is, kind of what the mission statement of, then kind of you've said like a whole load of nothing. You need to be there needs to be kind of a central point that's easily distilled. So I agree with you, kind of like oversimplification can be like a bad thing, but it's also necessary.
I get you,
as well, yeah,
to a certain extent, exactly. Yeah, that I thought it was really interesting that this does kind of, it advocates for both sides effectively. Yeah. I think it definitely advocates for the ways that simplifying things can be good. And I mean, even just you've touched on there, the fact that, you know, you have a background in immigration laws and stuff like that, you will understand stuff about the news way more than I will, you know? And so there is definitely importance to simplifying stuff so that people can understand and people can make their own choices and make their own mind up on what is good and what is bad, what is better and what is worse, right? But yeah, as well as this book also showing, or, you know, perhaps that's my interpretation of it from, like I say, making those connections with complaints that have been raised against people in the past and change that's happened in the past, it does flag how oversimplifying can also be damaging as well, by putting stuff down to just, is it change, can be a worry. But it is an interesting thing to pin it on, that idea that just moving forward and changing is inherently better than settling.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Like, one of the things that you mentioned was him being like a troublemaker, and I think one of the central tenets is not to go with the flow, is to stand up against injustice, I guess, wherever you find it. And I've been reading a little bit about kind of the difference between kind of like broadly Eastern philosophies and broadly Western philosophies. And Eastern philosophies, kind of like, there's this famous Japanese phrase, kind of like, the nail that stands up is the first one to get hammered down, sort of thing. And it's much more about kind of like being part of a cohesive whole to achieve something greater. And it's kind of interesting how this is very much more like a Western kind of approach to things, where it's about kind of like what the individual can achieve and what kind of individual achievement, rather than kind of like achieving something together as a whole, if that makes sense. So I thought that was kind of an interesting insight to maybe his political or his philosophical approach.
Yeah.
To
no,
things.
definitely. No, I think so. That's a very interesting point. And I think as well, it's very obvious this is a very personal book. You know, the author has made himself the protagonist in it, or, you know, at least the main character in this story. And it's very much his own interrogation of his own morality, you know, as being the author of it. He is both the prosecutor and the defendant. You know, you can imagine that he, you know, is having these debates with himself, you know, as he tries to go to sleep at night kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, you can really tell that this is someone's own thought process behind, am I a good person? What have I done with my life? Have I done the right things with my life? And that's all very interesting, though drawbacks to it are obviously that, in connection with what you just said, it is very about the individual, because it's very much just interrogating within himself. And I also felt it meant that I'm not sure quite how robust the arguments in that trial thing necessarily were, like just thinking of it as a debate. But I think I wouldn't want to tear that down too much, because this is a man personally just trying to figure it out in his own head. You know, it's not a structured debate of something outside of people. It is someone's own rationalization. And, you know, we all do this of, you know, you have that voice in your head telling you that you're terrible and you've done stuff wrong and you're a bad person, and, you know, and the other voices that are saying, actually, no, I did the right thing there and I had the right intentions there. And, you know, it's all that sort of doubt. And I think it's more that you can maybe forgive if you could come up with, you know, a better rebuttal to that point in the argument or stuff like that. That's less what it's about. It's less about it being about winning that debate, and it's more about that interrogation and that personal, I guess, reassurance sort of that you need, that you are doing okay and that you can be happy with your own personality, your own choices, your own self. That I thought was really interesting. It sort of connects with that, and also a bit more of a trigger warning if we're going on to my sort of issues with the interrogation, is that how much that prosecutor, who we remember is a kind of angelic force in a sense in the story, I believe, you know, certainly tied with that kind of you know, someone who can determine whether you go to heaven or not, using mental illness as a reason why someone is bad. I felt very uncomfortable in those sections, especially because it wasn't talking about the things that were done or the intentions, and talking about mental illness being a part of that. It seemed like they were making it very clear-cut as, this person has a mental illness, that makes them not good and makes them not eligible. And I felt very uncomfortable at those parts, and so wanted to at least raise that. That's quite interesting. It's not something that it's because it's interesting when I'm talking to you about, because there's certain things that you pick up on that I don't, and that's not something that I picked up on at all. And usually, kind of, especially with issues around mental illness, I'm quite sensitive to that sort of stuff. So that's definitely an interesting point to raise. Let's kind of move on from the trial bit, if that's okay, because I think the book for me is essentially split into two parts. Kind of the first half is about the trial, and then the second part really is this really affecting love story. Kind of like he kind of like waxes lyrical about how dearly he misses his wife, and how much in love with his wife he was, and he kind of beautifully writes and narrates the gaping hole that is kind of left in his life, and how marvelous he felt that his wife was. How did you kind of feel about that section? So I was nervous about it when it was coming up. There's sort of a lead up that kind of tells you that this is the shift that's going to happen. And I was a bit unsure how it went, but I did find it really powerful, and shows that sort of his main motivation for wanting to get into heaven is wanting to be reunited with her, basically. And that was all really touching. And I feel like we've only been talking about it recently with, I think, different people in my life, but it's kind of come up about feelings on the afterlife and stuff like that. And there's definitely a part of me that needs to believe that I can be reunited with those that I've lost. Is definitely a powerful force and thing in that. So that's definitely affecting, and I think it was well done in this book. And I also think, changing tone slightly, and we'll switch back a bit, but it's also interesting how it focuses quite a bit, a decent amount on his sexual urges, not in a sort of grotesque way, but as in it talks about the idea that, well, firstly, it uses that as a way to determine how in love he was with her, as to whether, he was having affairs, whether he just thought about her in that way or other people, which is, an interesting concept in itself as a way of judging what love is. But also that idea that in the afterlife, because you don't have a physical presence, you also don't have that. And it's something that I've toyed with for quite a while, is that the idea that if heaven's such a wonderful place, and yet it doesn't have the bodily pleasures of the world, you've got that. And I remember thinking when I was in high school, because there was a friend of mine who, it was very obvious that she always wanted to be a mother. She was definitely, she was going to have kids and she was going to look after kids, and this was kind of her life's purpose. And there was something then, I went to a Catholic high school, which is probably partly why I then connected that with thoughts about the afterlife. But I remember thinking in my head that it would be a kind of sad afterlife for her, because she wouldn't be having more kids, at the very least she wouldn't be pregnant with them, and I know that was something she was looking forward to as well as that physical part. So yeah, I thought, again, it's not as big of a part of the book as I'm making it out to be, but I thought it was interesting, that idea of, heaven being a great wonderful place, but also you don't have a lot of the pleasures that you do have in the real world, if you want to look at it that way. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that before we continue with the love part, but I again, that's not something that kind of pricked my attention too much. I don't really have too many kind of thoughts. No, that's fair. And as I say, I think it's very much, because given I could pin it back to that kind of specific high school memory, I think that is something that I was very much myself in tune to. And certainly going on about the love stuff and how he wants to be reunited, and what you say about how he writes it well and also narrates it well, I thought it was really important to point out here how you can really hear that emotion in the performance, and you can hear, as well as it in the performance, as in, what emotion he gives to it, you can also hear how much it's affected him back. You can hear the lump in your throat. It very much reminded me of Small, that we listened to, and how we talked about the fact that you could tell they got upset in the studio. While that's, you don't want to be pleasuring in someone getting upset, it's a really powerful thing that the audio brings, that you can hear how much it genuinely has affected the author narrator, that they are struggling to read those sections out in front of the mic.
Yeah, I think that especially comes across in the sections where he's talking about his late wife's cancer treatments.
Yeah.
And how you can kind of tell he's still quite angry about the way that the doctors handled that situation, and you can kind of tell there's a lot of passion in there about him specifically wanting there to be a better standard of care, and kind of I found that section particularly, I think that his emotions came across really powerfully there.
Yeah, and I also thought that going on to the narration and performance stuff, that it was really good in the trial as well. You could hear, like you said about passion, you could hear the passion when he was being the prosecutor, that was really emphatic. And I also felt like you could hear some kind of sarcasmness in it. So kind of before the trial, his wife is prepping him of you're going to need to make a case for yourself that, that this was all for good and that your intentions were pure, kind of thing. And I sort of feel like at the beginning of the trial, where he's kind of over-egging that, is kind of how I heard it. And that kind of I just had a call to fight for fairness sounded a bit sarcastic, the way he said it, in that he knew that he wasn't actually talking about his genuine motivations, not saying that he didn't see them as good, but that he was over-egging, I guess, the purity of them. And yeah, basically just saying that I thought the performance was really good in that section, as well as in general, to have those kind of nuances that you could yourself add to the text, but you're not necessarily given by the written word, that I thought was really good, for it just working well in audio for that reason, as well as Maurice doing a great job of bringing that to it.
Yeah. I agree with you.
I also wanted to talk as well how I think it works really well in audio for the fact that it feels very much like a play.
Yes, yeah.
And I wonder I think it is mentioned kind of his late wife's love of plays and
Poetry,
theatre,
yeah.
and as well as poetry and stuff. Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if it was inspired, by some of that, but it felt very play structured to me. It's very dialogue heavy, and in that way lends itself very well to being a kind of play. I did feel a little bit like I was sitting watching a play. I think the length does lend into that. It is sort of a play length piece.
Yeah.
And I could very much see this being something that you would go to the theatre to experience, sort of seeing the staging, and especially with the majority of it taking place in this kind of courtroom thing. It was very playy, so I feel like if you've got a theatrical bent to you, then you'd take a lot that you could really appreciate from this. As well. And also I thought it was interesting because with a lot of dialogue, it's also written literally play-wise, in the sense that you've got the person speaking colon, as opposed to lots of he said, she said. And I thought it was interesting, and I can't decide how I feel about it, the way that they did that in the audio, because I think it sort of there was quite a while where they included those. So before every line of dialogue, it had the name of the person who was saying it, line of dialogue, name, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then they sort of, when they felt you'd got into the swing of it enough, that fell out. And then maybe when it needed clarifying a bit more, they came back in. And yeah, I'm making an assumption that they didn't just read what was in the print. I haven't seen the print, I don't know. But yeah, I think on the majority of it, I felt that worked quite well, because I felt you did know who was speaking, but you also weren't constantly interrupted by this person, that person, that person. So yeah, maybe I'd have slightly done the balance slightly different. Maybe it was a bit long at the start where it still had each one, but I thought in general that was a really good way of doing it in the audio, and that sounded quite good, that it flowed quite well, and that it felt like you were listening to the play rather than having the screenplay read to you, I guess.
I mean, you could definitely see this maybe as like a one-man play, something like that. I think the other word that I've got kind of jotted down is like polemic, as well as kind of, it's a very kind of a rhetorical approach to certainly around the issues of kind of medical care. He also kind of speaks quite strongly in defense of, like, for lack of a better phrase, like political attacks, in terms of like politics needs to operate the way that it operates for this reason as well. And he puts a defense around that as well. Are there any kind of other points that you wanted to speak about?
I think that was kind of most of it. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept in itself of the immigration afterlife setup. It was really interesting to have the criteria be wanting change, and the love stuff, the drive of getting to the afterlife to be reunited with his wife, is really compelling. So yeah, they're sort of the plot points of the book, which I found really fascinating. And as I said, no matter what your views are politically, morally, stuff like that, they're all really either interesting questions or things that can really spark emotion in you, that I thought was really great about this. And then yeah, I thought it worked great in the audio. I think there were a few kind of glitchy bits in it, and a bit where the volume ebbed in and out. I don't know if that's the review copy we had or what, but yeah, it wasn't the tightest in that kind of way, in quality wise, but
you could kind of tell where they kind of spliced two sections together occasionally. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, if that's something that's going to bother you, it's something to be aware of, that it's not the most polished in that sense. But I really enjoyed listening to it. I think the audio, like I said just then about the play, is a great way to enjoy this, to experience this, for all those reasons. And also, I think, as well as the good performance we talked about, I think Maurice Saatchi has a really great voice to listen to. It was quite Julian Clary, is sort of what his voice reminded me of.
Oh, that's interesting.
Very much in a positive way, but yeah, that was the voice that kind of came to me, and I could listen to him, narrating a lot of stuff anyway. So I thought he, has a really lovely voice to listen to, just in general. Anyway, so yeah.
Cool. So let's maybe give our final thoughts on this. I don't know how I feel about this book. I think, the stuff that you're mentioning about being kind of quite thought-provoking in terms of the questions he asks about, have you done anything to try and change the world for the better? And then there's a lot of stuff that I agreed with in terms of like his passion for like social justice and attacking the inequality. It's just, for me, I couldn't separate what my approach to solving that problem would be compared to what his approach would be.
Yeah.
So I really struggled with those sections. He's a very persuasive guy, so you can kind of understand why he's achieved what he's achieved. But just for me, I couldn't kind of separate like my political leanings against kind of like what he's done and what he was saying.
Yeah.
Like the incongruity was just a little bit too strong. What I would say, the second half of the book is a really touching love story and kind of really touching way of, you know, just an insight into how painful losing someone can be and what that can kind of spur you on to do as well, and like how powerful that drive to be reunited with someone can be as well. So I think he narrates the book beautifully. I'm not too it's only 2 hours long, less than 2 hours long. I think it's definitely worth checking out for that reason alone. This is kind of like, I listened to this while I was on holiday. So yeah, definitely kind of, if you're just sitting on the beach, it's a pleasant enough thing to listen to. I'm not too sure I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a wishy-washy review. Sorry. Yeah.
No, don't be sorry. And because I completely get what you mean, I also really struggled with that. And especially because effectively the case of this book is asking the listener to see him as a good person.
Yeah.
Effectively, if you want to really boil it down, as I was saying, oversimplifying it. And that does bring some discomfort, especially when the political allegiances are brought so much to the fore. And like I said, there were other parts of it throughout that I was uncomfortable listening to. However, I really did like the thoughts that it sparked in me. You know, even if I wasn't agreeing with stuff, I thought it was interesting ways of looking at things. And whether I was either opening my mind to look at something the way that he'd posed me looking at it, or if I was taking something that was said and doing my own analysis on what he might not have realised he meant by it, or what other meaning there might be behind it, or what other, implications it has. I thought it was a really interesting thing to listen. And so I also think it is worth listening to. I think you can take a lot from it, but I can fully see why you're struggling to praise it when there is that real moral dilemma. It's a book about morality, and therefore our personal morality and our judgment on it is going to come into that, and how we feel about it. So it's an interesting one in terms of plot. It's a great one in terms of it being right for the audio format and being a really great performance. A nice one voice-wise to listen to. But it's got some things in it that you might not agree with, and it's okay either if you just straight up, I don't agree with that, or if you use that as a way of thinking around something else or whatever. So
that's great. So I think that's our review done. So we've got some really exciting news. So we're once again partnering this year with the British Book Awards. We'll be covering their non-fiction audiobook list this year. By the time this episode goes out, the nominations would have been announced. How do you feel about partnering with the British Book Awards again, Poppy?
Yeah, really excited. So glad that they reached out to us again, and looking forward to it. It's going to be really good. I hope you guys enjoy too.
And as always, guys, if you've got any questions, recommendations, you can contact us on social media at audiobookishpod, or on email at audiobookishpod@gmail.com. And if you can leave a rating or review wherever you find us, that will also be really helpful. Thank you very much for listening to the episode. Let's say bye, Poppy.
Bye.
Bye.